everybody, how's it going? It's Mr. White here with your Unit 3 test review, all about classical Asia. So, you need to get out your test review paper, the one that looks kind of like this. Probably also want to have out a piece of notebook paper, something to write with, so that you can follow along. And of course, make sure you study all of this information to get ready for your Unit 3 test, which is coming up on Thursday. So make sure that you're prepared for it. If you don't have the test review paper, you can always download this from my Google Sites. Just check this little link right here, and that'll take you to my Google Sites. Go under Course Resources and scroll all the way down to Unit 3 to download the Unit 3 test review. So without further ado, let's just jump in right on the first thing it talks about, which is bureaucracy. That's how you say that word, bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is a way to run a government. It's when a government is run by departments that are staffed with non-elected officials. Like, for example, the way that our government works. We have different departments like tax collectors. We have legal records departments where they have birth certificates and things like that. Of course, they have the Department of Education, which is like something that I work for. And of course, the post office. So if you think about all those different kinds of places, they're part of the government, but nobody voted for the people who work there. And so they have different levels of authority, and that's what we call a bureaucracy. Okay, moving right along. Next up is a dynasty. Now, a dynasty is a type of a political system where power passes from the ruler to the ruler's children after his or her death. That way, power stays in the hands of one powerful family, as opposed to changing from one family to another through elections or something like that. So basically, one royal family rules for many generations. A great example of a dynasty could be like the Qin Dynasty. You might remember that when Emperor Qin died, the power passed on to one of his sons. But unfortunately, his son was not strong enough to hold on to power, and eventually they lost the throne to the Han Dynasty. So that's what a dynasty is, a royal family that rules for many generations. Okay, number 3, the Silk Road. The Silk Road was an overland trade route. We've talked about it a lot, but it really helps to see a map of it. Okay, so you can see the map, and as you can see, it linked China with Central Asia and the Middle East. And this stretched all the way to the Mediterranean. If you look all the way on the far west part of this map, you can actually see Rome. And that was the final destination for many of the products that traveled from China on the Silk Road. They were on their way to Rome. You might also remember some of the things they traded. People in China were sending out things like silk. They also had many different types of technologies like crossbows and later on things like porcelain and mechanical clocks. But there were other things that people in the West desired, like for example spices that came from India. Now you might wonder, well, what did all the people in China and India want from Rome? Well, mostly they just wanted gold. They did get certain things like textiles or maybe even some kind of precious gems that came from the Roman Empire, but the majority of what the Romans were sending was gold. Okay, so let's see, well, it's not really a number, but the next thing it talks about is Hinduism. Okay, so Hinduism, you might remember, is a religious belief system that comes from India. That's really important to remember. Started in India. The other thing about Hinduism is that it's polytheistic. And in case you forgot what that means, it means that they believe in many gods, not just one god like Christians or Jews. The other thing about Hinduism is that they believe in something called karma. Karma, you may remember, is the idea that what goes around comes around. In other words, if you do good things, then good things will happen to you. But if you do bad things, then bad things will happen to you. And all of this is part of something called reincarnation. Now, reincarnation is the cycle of birth, death, and then rebirth. And the people in Hinduism believe that the way that you're reborn has to do with karma. So if you've got a lot of good karma, after you die, you'll get reborn as something better than you were in this life. But if you get a lot of bad karma after you die, you'll be reborn as something not as good as this life. Now, all this plays into something called the caste system. You may remember that the caste system was a social stratification system, basically like a way of ranking people in society. And it was started by a group of people called the Aryans. And when I talk about the Aryans, I'm not talking about Nazis. I mean a group of invaders who came from Central Asia into India. Now, the Aryans believed that they were superior to the native Indians, the people from the Indus Valley. And so they came up with this whole thing called the caste system, which basically said that the people at the bottom of society were there because they had bad karma from their last life. And that's how they were reincarnated, sort of as punishment. However, the Aryans and the people at the top of society had lots of good karma from their last life. And that's why they're at the top of society. This was all reinforced through something that the Aryans wrote called the Laws of Manu. And in the Laws of Manu, they talk about how there's this universal spirit, and the universal spirit was divided up into many different parts, and each of those parts became a different caste. So for example, the mouth of this universal spirit became the Brahmins, which was the highest caste. They're the ones that could talk to the gods. But the feet of this universal spirit became the Sudras. They're the ones at the bottom of society that sort of are the base, and everybody above them is sort of standing on top of them, sort of like how the lowest people in society are down at the bottom. So basically the whole purpose of the caste system was that it gave each group in India a separate occupation based on their caste. It gave everybody some sort of a role in society. And that was the reason why the caste system lasted so long and why it's such an important part of Hinduism. Okay, so that's a lot of info about Hinduism. Let's talk about another religion that's sort of similar to Hinduism, which is Buddhism. That's the next thing on your sheet. Now, Buddhism also started off in India. You may remember that it was founded by a Hindu prince named Siddhartha Gautama. Now, this guy Siddhartha, you may remember, went on sort of a spiritual journey to try to find the meaning of life. And during that spiritual journey, he sort of stumbled upon something he calls the Four Noble Truths, which basically say that all life is suffering, and that suffering has a cause, which is selfish desire, and that we can end selfish desire by following a sort of prescription for life that this guy Siddhartha, aka the Buddha, called the Eightfold Path. And the Eightfold Path is a way that Buddhists can eliminate suffering and sort of end all their selfish desires as a way to reach something called nirvana, which is a way to break out of the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. You may remember that, much like Hindus, Buddhists also believe in the idea of karma and the idea of reincarnation, the idea that souls are reborn after they die. Okay? So, moving right along, since we're talking about Buddhism, let's talk about this guy called Ashoka Maurya. Now, you may remember that Ashoka Maurya was a king from the Mauryan dynasty in India. He started off as a pretty violent guy, but then he converted to Buddhism and decided that it was his goal to spread Buddhism all over the world. So it's actually Ashoka Maurya who spread Buddhism from India to China. That's why people in China believe in Buddhism today. He also built infrastructure all over India. Infrastructure, you may remember, means things that help people and help the society, like, for example, roads and hospitals. He built those things for the people of India. And he also posted laws on what were known as rock pillars. And when you give out your laws as a king, sometimes that's called an edict. So most of the time we refer to these as rock pillar edicts. So those are the most important things that you need to remember about this guy called Ashoka Maurya. Now, the other great empire from India were the Guptas. You may remember that the Guptas are considered to be part of the golden age of India because they did a lot of really important things that influenced India and the modern world today. Some of the achievements of the Guptas were things like reviving and preserving Hindu traditions. Hinduism was not banned under the Mauryans, but it began to decline. And so when the Guptas came to power, they revived Hinduism and they built temples and they sort of helped preserve Hinduism to become what it is today. They also wrote poetry and dramas. They were really into the arts. You may remember that they wrote famous tales like the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita and the Ramayana, some of those really famous epic poems. And they also made advancements in math, like, for example, they invented the numbers that we use today. They also invented the number zero and the concept of zero. They were really good with science, especially astronomy. You may remember that they calculated the Earth's tilt, and they also knew that the Earth revolved around the sun. And last of all, they also were advanced in medical technology. Now, that's one thing we didn't talk about too much in class, but you may or may not realize the Guptas were actually some of the first people to perform complex surgical procedures. So that's why we consider the Guptas part of the golden age of India, one of the best times in Indian history because of all the great accomplishments they had. Okay, next up, classical China's geography. Well, it's not just classical China's geography. Really, it's just China's geography because China is still China, right? So if you forgot about China's geography, then you need to check this map. Now, when we're looking at this map here, you can see that the western and northern parts of China are covered by huge mountains and arid deserts. This is why Chinese civilization developed in the east. You see there in the east, near the water? Yeah, that's where all the Chinese people live. This is also why Chinese culture was able to develop and maintain traditions that stayed in place for thousands of years. All these geographic barriers isolated them from Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. So China's isolation reinforced a traditional way of life. That's a really important fact that you need to remember about Chinese history. Okay? So when we talk about geography, we may also remember that there was a way that the Chinese were able to change their geography, and that brings us to our next point, the Great Wall of China. Now, the Great Wall is built all across the rural landscape of northern China, and it was built to protect them from invasions from people who came from the north. We're talking about the Mongols. Now, China's physical environment was changed by the Great Wall, and like I said, the whole purpose of it was to protect them from invasions from the north. The geographic challenge of constructing the wall across all these mountains is also a great example of the advanced construction techniques used by the Qin Dynasty. They were actually pretty good at building things. You may even remember that I told you that they actually buried some bodies inside of the wall because, it was too much work to carry them all the way down those mountains. Alright, next up, there's no number. I keep saying number 10. For me, it's number 10 because I like to number off my test review, but the next thing it talks about is the mandate of heaven. Okay, so the mandate of heaven is the idea that China's rulers are actually chosen by God. And basically, if a dynasty ever became weak or corrupt, the gods would cause disasters to happen as a sign of their disapproval for that dynasty. So when that happens, the ruling dynasty is seen as having lost the mandate of heaven. Therefore, rebellion is justified by the people. The people need to rise up and get rid of that bad dynasty. So after war and bloodshed, then a new ruler will naturally emerge and take power. Now, if that ruler can establish peace and prosperity, then that means his dynasty is seen as having earned the mandate of heaven. This whole thing is what we call the dynastic cycle. As you can see in this graphic right here, the dynastic cycle starts when a new dynasty takes power. Things go good for a while, but then eventually the dynasty declines. When the dynasty declines, disasters happen. There's a lot of upheaval and bloodshed. Eventually a new dynasty comes to power, and the whole process starts over again. Okay, so the mandate of heaven is really important to the dynastic cycle. And it was pretty successful because it lasted 3,000 years. But one of the biggest weaknesses of the dynastic cycle is that when emperors died, they usually had more than one son, which often led to power struggles because there was always lots of questions about who would succeed. So all these questions of succession led to lots of violence and sometimes civil war. Okay, so next up, let's talk about Confucianism. Now, you might remember that Confucianism was started by a Chinese philosopher called Confucius, and he was somebody who believed very strongly in things like filial piety, meaning respect for your elders. He also thought that you shouldn't just respect your elders in your family, but you should respect all people in authority above you. And the people who are in authority should also have respect and be good role models for the people who are below them. He also thought that traditions and honoring traditions was very important. And he also thought that ancestor worship was an important way to maintain peace and harmony on earth. So with all those things, the number one thing that's stressed by Confucianism is the emphasis on education. You may remember that Confucius thought that education could turn a pauper into a gentleman. If you don't know what a pauper is, that means like just a poor person, a person of humble background. Because of this belief in the power of education, that's why Confucian leaders, like for example the Han Dynasty, thought that the best way to promote good government workers was to fill government positions with well-educated and well-mannered men. That's where this whole idea of the civil service exam came in, and we'll talk about that a little later in the test review. So this was how the Han hoped to promote order in Chinese society, by encouraging people to incorporate Confucian values like filial piety and respect and education into their everyday life. Okay, and since we're talking about filial piety, I've said that a couple times. Real quick, remember that filial piety simply means respect and care shown to elders, especially your parents and your grandparents. So in China, there's a big emphasis on taking care of the elderly. And that's one of the main reasons why Chinese families tend to be very big, and why Chinese families always want to have sons, because it's always the son's responsibility to take care of the parents until they die. So in a way, this is sort of a form of social security that they have in China. Okay? So remember, filial piety, respect for elders. Next up, Zhou Dynasty. Whew, this is a pretty dense topic, but remember that the Zhou Dynasty, and I know it looks like Zhao, but it's Zhou, they were the second dynasty. They ruled after the Shang Dynasty, and they ruled through a system called feudalism. And if you don't remember what feudalism is, remember that that is a decentralized type of government system, where the ruler entrusted local lords and nobles to control the different regions of his kingdom. Now, this gave the lords a lot of power. Some would actually say too much power. And eventually, many of these lords started building up their own private armies and began to challenge each other and quarrel over territory. Now, this eventually led to a 300-year-long civil war in China, which was known as the Warring States period. And it was all this war and turmoil that brought down the Zhou Dynasty. All of the problems led the people to feel like the Zhou Dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven. And eventually, that led to the rise of the next empire, which was the Qin. So let's talk about the Qin Dynasty now. So the Qin Dynasty was led by that guy called Qin Shi Huangdi. And remember that Qin Shi Huangdi took over after the Zhou Dynasty, because remember he said that they had lost the mandate of heaven. And to keep China under control and to prevent any more civil wars, Emperor Qin ruled through a very, very strict system known as legalism. If you forgot what legalism is, that's the system where Emperor Qin would inflict death and torture on the people who were disobedient to him. But he also lavished many things like encouragements and rewards on the people who were very loyal to him. So Emperor Qin was able to keep China under control basically through terrorizing the population with this very, very strict system called legalism. Now, Qin also changed many things in China for the better. Like, for one thing, he standardized the currency, meaning the coins. He also standardized weights and measurements, and he standardized the writing system that's still used in China today. He also built infrastructure like roads and canals to improve trade, and he's the one who's credited with basically beginning construction on the Great Wall. However, on the other hand, he also burned books of people who disagreed with him, like the Confucian scholars, and he often killed people who questioned him. So I guess there's a bit of a debate on whether or not Qin was really a great emperor. When he died, he was buried in a massive tomb guarded by 8,000 terracotta soldiers. You may remember those terracotta soldiers from the presentation in class, or maybe you've just seen them before on TV. They're pretty famous. Also, when Emperor Qin died, China was named after him. That's actually why we still call it China, the land of Qin, even today. But unfortunately, even though Emperor Qin was a great ruler in his own right, his son was a pretty bad ruler. And when his son took over, he was seen as being weak, and therefore having lost the mandate of heaven. So just 4 years after Emperor Qin died, his son lost the throne, and that was the end of the Qin Dynasty. But it was the beginning of a brand new dynasty known as the Han Dynasty. So that's who we're going to talk about next. Okay, so the Han Dynasty. Now, the Han Dynasty came right after the Qin Dynasty. Remember we said that because Emperor Qin's son was a bad ruler, a lot of people felt like the Qin had lost the mandate of heaven. And So a general from the Qin army called Liu Bang actually took over and seized power. And since he was able to restore peace and prosperity, and because the people just liked him a lot better, he was seen as having the mandate of heaven. And so Liu Bang started a new dynasty, which he called the Han Dynasty. Now, when Liu Bang came to power, a lot of people wanted to see China go back to its traditional ways. So the Han Dynasty incorporated Confucian values into the way that they ruled China. As a matter of fact, they wanted to bring Chinese society back to its traditions by incorporating Confucian values into their everyday life. And so they did things like emphasizing more education. And one of the ways that they were able to emphasize more education was through a civil service exam. You may remember that this was sort of like a standardized test, kind of like the STAR test. And those who passed this exam were given really good jobs in the government. This meant that even if you were born as a poor person, if you got a good education, you could end up being a very powerful, very wealthy person. So if you really think about it, in many ways, this is a lot like the American university system. Kids from all different backgrounds study really hard in school so that they can get into a good college. And the whole reason why kids want to get into a good college is to have more money and more power and more influence than they would without a good education. And so, in many ways, that's sort of a similar system to what we have. You might remember that Confucianism believes that the government should be staffed with well-educated, well-mannered young men. And so the Han Dynasty thought the best way to find these well-educated, well-mannered men was through sort of like a standardized test, the civil service exam. Okay, last of all is the fall of the Han Dynasty compared with Rome. And you may remember that in class we had a little activity where you had to sort out some cards to find out the similarities and the differences between the fall of the Han and the fall of the Roman Empire. They had a lot of things in common. You might remember, for example, they both got to be way too big geographically. They suffered from invasions from barbarian tribes, and the rulers eventually devalued the currency by spending too much. They all became very corrupt. But the one thing that was very different between the fall of the Han and the fall of the Rome is the result. You may remember that when the Roman Empire fell apart, Roman culture and institutions did not continue in the former parts of the Roman Empire. As a matter of fact, all across Europe, when Rome fell apart, their culture stopped, and this was the beginning of a time that we call the Dark Ages. Everything was pretty bad in Europe. However, in China, when the Han Dynasty fell apart, their culture continued more or less unchanged. The culture and the institutions of the Han Dynasty survived for another 1,800 years. So that would be probably the biggest difference between the fall of the Han and the fall of Rome. Okay guys, well, that's it. We're at the end of this long test review, and I know it was stressful. I know that was a lot of information to write down, but now that you've done all that work, you need to actually go through and study this stuff. I suggest find a friend, quiz each other, you know, start getting ready for this test, because just writing this is not enough. You actually have to study it, okay? The other thing that you need to pay attention to is this little part right down here at the bottom, the short answer prompts. Remember that if you're in K level, there's going to be 2, and if you're in on level, there's going to be 1. It's going to be one of the ones that I put on your test review, but you don't know which one. So if you're smart, you'll actually go through your notes and go through what we've talked about and prepare a good response for each one. Now, remember, that doesn't mean you have to write a whole essay for each one, but I would at least list out the concepts that you would want to explain to make sure that you get full credit for each one of these essay prompts, because of course you only have one class period to take the test and write the essays. So if you're prepared, you will thank yourself on Thursday. And with that being said, remember that our test is this Thursday. So you do need to study, you need to prepare, and if you do that, I would be surprised if you thought this was a hard test. As a matter of fact, I think if you study and prepare, it's going to be a really easy test. So good luck to you, study hard, and we'll see you on the test day.